Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm off mic. Welcome to our very last seminar, except for the student event next week, but our last of outside guest seminars to the IRES series. And Naveen is going to introduce Erle Ellis, but I will start with the land acknowledgement. And I just want to say to faculty, Nivea sent around a short course that we can do online on thinking more deeply about the land acknowledgement. So I encourage people to have a look at that. But today I'd just like to acknowledge that if you're on Point Grey, you're situated on the traditional and ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation. And I'd also like to acknowledge that you might be joining us from many places today, whether it's Greater Vancouver area or much further away than that, and to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Naveen,
all right. I'm delighted to introduce a colleague and a friend, Erle Ellis, to our department seminar today. He's a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems at the University of Maryland. And as of yesterday's news, he's also the Presidential Research Professor for 2021 to 2024. I'm not sure what that means, but congratulations on that recognition, Earl. Earl began his career with a PhD in plant physiology, and not something you would probably easily guess if you've been following his more recent work. After his PhD, he did some really interesting work on the ecology and kind of biogeochemistry of rural agricultural landscapes in China, which are heavily managed, human-managed landscapes. He told me once that it was during this work in China that he developed the concept of village landscapes, essentially places in the world that are heavily populated, but also intensively managed. That kind of on the ground work fed into his subsequent work on mapping the world's anthropogenic biomes, in which villages are a prominent biome. More recently, he's been a leading thinker on the Anthropocene. He's collaborated with nearly 250 archaeologists in a project called ArchaeoGlobe to understand kind of the deep history of human relationships with nature, debunking the pristine myth, which I think he'll talk about today. In his role on the Anthropocene Working Group, Earle has argued, therefore, that human influence began much earlier than is commonly imagined, and certainly much earlier than the 1950s, which is currently the kind of preferred starting date for the Anthropocene. All of this work has led to kind of broader conceptual work on what it means to live sustainably in the Anthropocene, which I think is the topic of the seminar today. And wanted to add that apparently there's a paper coming out in PNAS on Earth Day this year on anthropogenic biomes. So please keep an eye out for that. So the microphone is all yours, Earle. Thanks for joining us.
All right, thank you, Naveen. Thank you, Naveen, for inviting me. And it's always good to see your face again. And it's true, and we work together to develop the concept of anthromes that has really guided my work since we put that idea together. And it's guided also the work that you're going to see today, although I'm not going to talk so much about anthromes. They'll figure in here. And I'm not going to talk so much about deep time, although you'll see a fair amount of that, because I want to talk mostly about not really when the Anthropocene began, but why people have shaped the planet. Why have people reshaped the planet? Why is that occurring? And then given that humans are now a force of nature that can shape a planet, what are we going to do with that capability? What can we do? And so that's what I'm going to talk about. And of course, the question of, is there actually a we anyway? So I always start off with this slide, even though you've probably seen this image a million times before. It's the Earth glowing at night, as seen from satellites. And what I want to say about it is very simple. How can you explain this scientifically? How can you explain that the planet Earth now glows at night? And I think the interesting fact about this glowing is that it's not physical, and it's not chemical, and it's not even biological. It's not because there's so many human beings on the planet that the planet now glows at night, right? This is the artifact, not intended consequence of our energy systems. It's not, nobody's trying to light up the planet at night. Yet the planet does now glow at night, something easily observable from space. And it does because of social practices. It took a very long time to learn how to do this and to build the material infrastructure that it takes to light up the planet for no particular purpose. Actually, it's all lighted up for local purposes, but it glows globally. All right, and I think that's a very good metaphor for the Anthropocene. Most of the global consequences of what human societies have done on this planet are unintended consequences that, of course, are transformative, and they can only be understood as social processes. They are simply not explainable just as biological processes. There's many good reasons why we think of the Anthropocene, this human age, as a crisis. We are transforming the Earth faster and at greater scales than ever in the history of the planet. But we also have to look deeper. When do we start causing this deforestation? And this is just another metaphor of a geoglyph. This is a symbolic earthwork uncovered by rapid deforestation in Amazonia, revealing a much deeper, earlier history of human social change that transformed environments that are often now considered by many to represent a kind of pristine nature, but in fact have a deep human history. Again, a metaphor for the Anthropocene. Humans have started transforming the planet long before we have agriculture. Although, as we'll see today, agriculture is one of the most transformative things that human beings have ever accomplished on this planet. Nevertheless, we start off with Stone Age hunter-gatherers capable of driving extinctions of megafauna that, as you know, if you're an ecologist, transform entire landscapes, even cause the vanishing of entire biomes, just because of the importance of these megafauna. And of course, humans are an omnivorous megafauna that's also highly social and has tools like fire and stone tools that no other species has been able to master. So these changes on the planet don't start with, for example, burning fossil fuels, although of course, again, a huge transformative technology, but they begin much earlier. So we could start as early as the megafauna. I don't know if you can see my pointer here. Can you see that? Excellent. So you could look at megafauna, but really the big transformation that began thousands of years ago is the origins of agriculture and its effects on the Earth system and biodiversity, but also, of course, climate is what gets a lot of attention. Humans began altering climate when they started altering vegetation and ecosystem carbon storage thousands of years ago by clearing forests, tilling the soil, and flooding rice paddies and managing large herds of megafauna as livestock. So the biggest change that people have ever made to the planet so far, we are very rapidly moving to a time when burning fossil fuels is going to cause the biggest changes that have ever occurred on this planet caused by people. But agriculture to date is likely the very biggest global change. It occupies about 40% of Earth's terrestrial surface area, depending on how you compute it. And it is what transformed the planet from a place where you could understand the patterns of life on Earth just by the patterns of climate, right? The classic patterns of the biomes, to a planet where we have to use this concept that we just talked about, Navin and I's early work, on anthropogenic biomes, the patterns of nature shaped by human societies over the long term. And so I would say that's the first law of the Anthropocene, is that people are transformative, and they transform Earth's ecology in a way that it resembles, in a sense, this global transformation and shaping of evolution through climate. The patterns of climate shape evolution and the species that live across the Earth. People and their societies now shape those patterns as much as climate does. And they're going to continue to do this for the foreseeable future. This is not something that's just going to go away. This is pretty much permanent from all practical purposes, from a human perspective at least. Why do people transform ecology so much, right? We're just animals. We're big animals, we're megafauna. But why do humans transform ecology so much? So I'm going to talk about a theory that explains this. And of course, there's probably more than one out there, but this is the theory that I call anthroecology theory. And it's based on this principle of sociocultural niche construction. And I'm going to explain that very quickly because I think it's really critical, especially for natural scientists who aren't familiar with these concepts, to understand what is different about the way that human societies and humans interact with nature. So the classic view of ecology is, and evolution is, this kind of what we call a one-way street of evolution. Here you have the biotic part of an ecosystem. This could be an organism or a community, and it is shaped by the abiotic environment. Soils, climate here is shaping it. And these one-way interactions, right? Species have to adapt to their environment. All right, that's true. This is the classic view of evolutionary change, right? As species adapt through their genetic inheritances are shaped by the abiotic environment. But of course, we also know better that it's also possible to go the other direction, that organisms can shape their environments. And there's a lot of organisms that do this. I always put up this slide of beavers because they build structures that resemble ours. But think about bacteria reshaping their environment with certain chemicals that they release. And for that reason, they live in that environment differently. And when they do, when a species lives in its environment and when it changes its environment, it changes its adaptive fitness. In other words, like the beaver, makes the environment more suitable for itself and less suitable for some other species. That's called an ecological inheritance. Okay, just like a genetic inheritance, it's like an ecological inheritance. And that's the concept of niche construction. And I'm going to go through this stuff very quickly. If you're really interested, the paper you can find at that anthroecology.org, this ecology and an anthropogenic biosphere monograph explains all this. So we need a more complex theory in which we see organisms not only are shaped by the environment through evolution, they shape their environment, creating a two-way street of evolution, right? Much more complicated to understand, right? But much more accurate. Now, we have to understand a few more things, right? We have to understand culture. And culture is not something unique to humans at all. A lot of species have culture. And this is an example of a sparrow that must learn its mating calls from others in the environment in order to reproduce. If it can't socially learn these traits, this song, it cannot reproduce. So in other words, it's a cultural inheritance. Culture is simply socially learned information. In this case, the socially learned behavior is required for reproduction of this species. We also need to understand sociality. Sociality also not at all unique to humans. In fact, evolved hundreds of millions of years ago with the social insects, which are still among us and also very common. The thing to know about all the other social species is that their sociality is genetic. It is biologically determined. You want to know how big a hive of bees is going to be? You just need to know the species, and you can determine approximately what the social relationships are going to be for that set of organisms. With humans, we have socially defined or culturally defined social organization. How big can a human society be? Depends, doesn't it? What do people do in the environment? Depends on culture. It all depends on culture. We're also so good at culture compared to other species that our culture accumulates at incredible rates. Language is one of those great skills that we have to transmit our culture with high fidelity. But the bottom line is human culture accumulates, and that's considered relatively exceptional in the biological world. So that's an exceptional trait, ultrasociality. We also have a trait where, just like I said, our sociality is not biologically constrained. It is socially learned. The way that you interact socially is socially learned. We also have the trait that we very commonly exchange subsistence with non-kin. Okay, in a hive where people are where insects are feeding each other, they're all related. They're like all sisters or cousins. In a human society, we're all feeding each other and we're not related very strongly. Okay, and that's also exceptional in the biological world. Put those things together, all those elements together, sociality, cultural inheritance, the ecological inheritance, we get sociocultural niche construction. It is socially learned, therefore culturally, the way that we construct the human niche. It is also socially enacted. We do it together. We don't do it by ourselves. We are a social species. So it's sociocultural niche construction. This is a relatively unique practice of human beings that is always evolving and is always different depending on time and place and culture. It is a very diverse pattern around the world. So we need a more sophisticated model of understanding human social interaction with environments because of this sociocultural niche construction and the accumulation of cultural inheritances. It changes over time, like all systems do, in this case through evolution, the accumulation and the, of course, selection for certain traits. And we should think about two different kinds of long-term change. One is just the gradual accumulation and selection of inheritances, cultural, ecological, material inheritances. I'm not going to go into detail today, but also regime shifts when you have very big changes in the way systems operate. For example, the jet aircraft introduces international travel of a different kind and changes ecology. It changes the way societies operate. It changes material exchange. Everything changes together. And that's a regime shift in sociocultural niche construction. If we look at the big picture, really big picture, I would call these the meta regime shifts. These are not the little changes that are always going on, but the really big ones, bigger than any single regime shift, are these long-term transitions between modes of societies like the hunter-gatherer societies that have changed and evolved. There's a lot of different types of hunter-gatherer societies, incredible rich diversity of societies, ranging from those that are mostly hunting focused to those that actually shape their ecologies tremendously through various practices. And of course, as we see the long-term patterns of these societies, this is not a linear kind of pattern. It's a pattern that looks linear in this chart. In reality, like any evolutionary pattern of change, it is a tree. It diversifies. Hunter-gatherer societies are just as adaptive today in certain environments and still are around. So it's not saying that things just go in one direction. But the bottom line is we can see these patterns over time, right? We see larger scale societies after the smaller scale ones, and they evolve from the smaller scale ones. Okay, and so we have these social upscaling occurring over the long term. How big can human societies get? We don't know yet. Maybe trillions, we don't know. And then we also know that human societies have gained some interesting capacities. We don't just rely on human biological energy to construct our niche, right? We don't just do it by hand. We get animals to do it. We use fire to do it, which is using biomass from the environment to serve our purposes. So we use more and more energy over time. Then we start using the fossil biomass of the planet. And more interestingly, now we learn to do what plants can do. We can use abiotic energy. We can use solar energy directly to harness and shape our niche. We can use nuclear energy. We can use wind. All these other sources of abiotic energy that aren't constrained by the biosphere are now useful to sustain human society. So that's another interesting trend that occurs over time. But of course, from my perspective as an ecologist, I'm very interested in the niche construction intensity, which is a fancy way for us terrestrial species to talk about land use intensity. And of course, for a lot of you, especially people like Naveen, know this stuff very well. Land use intensification over time is well known. It's also commonly driven, of course, by demand, which we'll talk about in a second. But the bottom line is we also see this pattern of it takes a lot of land to sustain a hunter-gatherer society, but that land is not transformed very much. It's very much like a wild land, although that does change as people start using fire to clear the land and this sort of thing. Even in hunter-gatherer societies, this is practiced. And as we get to larger scale societies, less land is used per person. Obviously, a larger society has more people, so it could use more land. But per person, it gets more and more efficient at using land. But the land that it uses is more and more transformed over time. So the intensity of niche construction is increasing over time. As we'll see, that's a long-term pattern. We can go from the foraging patterns to long fallow shifting cultivation, using less and less land per person and supporting more and more people. And so there's a general pattern. You don't have to say cause and effect, but you see the pattern of larger scale, denser societies have more intensive use of land, produce more from the same land. Another trend that we see at the same time is that you start seeing settlements increase in size. Why do they get bigger and bigger? Well, there's a reason. There's a return. If you're a social species, being more connected with others actually has a lot of advantages. So this is in ancient societies that you get more return on investment for your life when you live in a denser and denser area. And that trend is still continuing, and it is now accelerating with the great global urbanization of today, which is of course affecting especially the developing world. A lot of the developed world went through this 100 years ago, but it continues today. And again, it has the same purposes. It's people are moving to the city to take advantage of the benefits of trade and medicine and all sorts of things that are easy to do in the larger scale urban environment. The biggest effects of urbanization are felt outside the city. We often think about urbanization as just about cities, but actually the biggest effect of urbanization is what it does to the global food system. Small scale farmers feed themselves, but large scale agriculture feeds the cities. And it feeds them through global supply chains. And when you're investing in this kind of operation, it does not pay to use land that is anything less than the best of land and to use it at anything less than the largest of scales. That's where the economy of scale comes in. And it's really what has enabled us to solve the food problem of the 20th century and the 21st century. The reason that there's more food produced per capita is because our agriculture is so intensive at scale. So it just proves that there's no problem you can't solve with a bigger problem. And you could argue that's what people have been doing through all of time, is by scaling up, you solve the problems of the smaller scale by creating a larger scale, and you create whole new problems that you have to deal with. Sometimes they're better problems. Like, for example, one of the big problems today is that people are living so long. Big problem. It's the kind of problem you want to have. But the bottom line is, it doesn't like everything gets easier and better. It just changes, and it changes at scale. So now we live on a planet that is transformed by the largest scale, most capable societies that have ever existed. We are more interdependent as societies than we ever have been. And that is both, of course, a little bit frightening. And with the pandemic, of course, this is also something that helped the pandemic move along so quickly. But it's also a superpower. For social species, this is a kind of superpower. We are now interconnected in real time, globally, as individuals. There's no other social species that can do that. And so really the powers of social change have never been more powerful. And ecological change on this planet, ever since people started shaping the planet, has been a process of social change. As societies change, they change the environments of the planet. And cultural change is ultimately what shapes societies. So social change is cultural change and ecological change. And we have this good trend, like it was basically what I just said. If we look here at food supply per person, that's the green line, it's gone up over time. Okay, and this was exactly what was not expected to happen by Paul Ehrlich back in the 1960s. It looked like it was just a disaster waiting to happen. The population growth rates had never been higher. Food growth was going up, but could it go up as fast as this rate? No, it could not. This looked really bad. The good news was that Paul Ehrlich was wrong about the trend continuing, because population growth rates have crashed and they are continuing to crash. So even though populations continue to grow and they're getting bigger and bigger, that growth rate has slowed down tremendously, and food supply per capita is still increasing. Yet surprisingly, agricultural land area is not going up in any significant way. It's moving around. The types of land use are changing to become more intense, but the total amount of land in agriculture is not changing significantly, even while there's more food per person and there's more people. That's that niche construction intensity taking effect. And it is, as I started off with the abstract of this talk, this is one of those forces that we have to work with as human societies scale up, is that we can also construct the niche for the human individual in society more effectively as societies scale up. Theoretically, this can lead to what we already see on the ground in many places. This is an example of really just illustrating the forest transition, the recovery of areas after agriculture intensifies. Marginal lands are not of interest to large-scale agriculture, just the best land. And so a lot of land is being abandoned as farmers are seeking the kind of the benefits of the urban areas. And therefore, we're seeing a mass recovery of habitats in large areas of the world. Although, of course, there are other areas where we are seeing some expansion of agriculture. We also see a lot of areas where we see a lot of recovery. And I'm going to argue now that the real question is not how we can keep people from destroying the planet, which is all too commonly heard at universities, in the environmental science world, and geography, all the disciplines I commonly relate to. It's always a story of stopping the end of the world. I would argue it's a very different situation. We have the potential to shape a biosphere quite different than the biosphere we're shaping now. The potential for a very different and potentially very much better future for both for people and for the natural world or the non-human world. is very, very possible. But the question is, what do we really want? And is there such a thing as we? I would argue there's really is no we. And that's one of the greatest challenges, right? Different people want different things. Okay, and that's one of the big challenges, negotiating among all these demands. Let's just talk about two different elements of this future idea. If we could make the future different than today, what would the design be like? And this is one example of a design space. This is Yosemite Valley, for anyone who doesn't recognize it right away. And there's another valley nearby called Hetchy Hetchy that's underneath a reservoir. This is a land use, and it just happens to be a land use of conservation of nature. And that is increasingly of interest to people everywhere, including, as I'll show at the end, in a place where I worked a lot, as Naveen said, in China. So that's one way of shaping the planet, is to shape some parts of the planet as places that are conserved for the rest of life. Okay, and we're getting more and more ambitious at that. People are more and more interested. Now we've heard of, you probably, I don't know if, yeah, Canada is on board, I think, with 30% by 2030. Well, this is about where we are with protected areas. And the idea is 30% by 2030, in case you don't know this, emerged from the half Earth and nature needs half movements as part of 50% by 2050. It's just step one. A lot of people don't take it all that way, but that's actually where the idea comes from. So could we think very differently about the way we interact with the planet to actually reserve a very substantial part, half of the planet, for the rest of life on Earth? And this is also something that's come out of that idea. And this is a globally optimized pattern of conservation for half of the Earth. You ready when they show up at your house with the map? It says, well, according to our globally optimized map, we've decided your neighborhood is now going to be a protected area. You ready for that? I mean, from my point of view, it's a curiosity. It's interesting, and it's a neat idea to come up with these things. And this idea of Earth stewardship being this kind of top-down, high-tech dashboard of the planet. It's a curiosity, but it's not A, going to work, or B, going to be fair. In my view, this is Earth stewardship, not this planetary top-down imagining, although I think it's good to have that imagining and to share it in a way that is not just, here we've come to save you, but rather, let's talk about what we can do to make more space for the rest of nature. But anyway, it's going to be a negotiation. It's not going to be something that's done top-down, and it's going to have to involve people that have often been neglected or even worse in land rights. And for example, indigenous peoples control a huge amount of land that is now suddenly of value to conservationists. And so there's new bedfellows, new partners in how to shape the better future for nature and for the rest of people. This is some work, Naveen and Zia Mehrabi, who I don't know if Zia is there, but bottom line is, it depends on how you want to allocate this land. If you allocate it from the point of view of, let's just make big areas with nothing in it except for conservation, versus let's share the landscape with a little bit of everything here and there, which plan is the most effective? Which plan would not displace the most agriculture and the ability to feed people? And it turns out sharing the landscape has a lot of benefits. You hear so much about land sparing, land sharing, which I don't really want to get into because I don't believe it's the best way to
5 minutes remaining.
5-minute warning?
Yeah.
Already. Work cut out for me. All right. So if we're going to share the planet, the first thing we have to know is that this is not a planet that is mostly wild and has this kind of lots of nature out there without people in it. That's just not the way this planet is. It's an ancient planet. It's a planet where climate is changing rapidly. So if we want to conserve species, we can't do it necessarily by just keeping them where they are. It's a planet that's on the move. And we've already built our infrastructure across the whole planet in a way that really wasn't thought about for any other species. It's good for us, not so good for any other species. That's the kind of the situation we have. That's the Anthropocene design space, is not this kind of wild places out there. That is part, but it is not the major lion's share of what the planet is like. The real challenge, I would argue, for the better future for nature and for the rest of people is for managing multifunctional landscapes, landscapes that can conserve nature and can sustain people. That is the grand challenge. And it is not necessarily easy. Just because you want to do a win-win doesn't mean you get a win-win. And this is just an example of a lose-lose, right? This is how you get killed by a herbivore, right? You've created a space where two types of transportation interact only negatively. That's not inevitable. There are solutions. And this is one, I believe it is from Canada. And this is an example, right, of a wildlife bridge. And now that's becoming increasingly a part of the way that infrastructure regulations are set up. It's possible to do two things in the same space. We need to do this at scale. It's not enough just to do it in one roadway at a time. It also needs to be thought about for migrating toward the poles, because that's something that's going to be necessary in this rapidly changing planet. And there's one other good piece of news. I had talked about intensification. The other thing that's really important to understand is that people's valuation of nature, what people want to do with the landscape, is evolving. It is not fixed. And it is changing because of cultural change. And I'm just going to bring up an example from China. In the 1990s, I lived in Beijing. In the wintertime, it was just miserable, gray, cold, dusty. And in the springtime, first time I was living there, went to the park, and sitting down, it was, getting a little warmer, and I started hearing the birds singing, and I thought, it's not so bad in Beijing, really. And then I looked around, and this was all the singing birds. There were no other birds in the trees. It was just the birds in people's cages. That was about as good as you were going to do if you were seeking nature in your urban life in Beijing in 1990. But I can tell you, everything has changed in China. You already know that, but this is just an example. This person is not abusing these pandas. This person is the biggest funder of panda conservation in the world. And so he's benefiting from that here. And people don't have the same vision for nature that they used to have. In the deep past, and did I miss a slide? No, I did. I just got them out of order. I usually show this one next. People are willing to do what it takes to sustain pandas now in China. It used to be you could go see a panda riding a motorcycle. You cannot see that anymore. What you see is people doing something like this, captive rearing. This person is wearing a panda suit covered in panda urine. Really, it's not easy, but people are willing to do the work to bring species back. This is the wolf coming back in Europe, one of the most densely populated landscapes in the whole planet. And you're seeing a deadly carnivore that people are often afraid of. It's costly to live with, but people love the wolf. Not everybody. Some people hate the wolf, some people love the wolf, but in general, there's enough demand. Culture has changed and people want the wolf back. Culture is changing and people are living differently in urban areas. This is kind of a vanguard, right? This is the Bosco Verticale in Milan. It's an urban forest. This is the urban forester managing it. But we can think differently about the future. The future isn't just going to be like the past. So when we think about the planet we live on today, it's a planet that's being shaped by the most social species that has ever lived on Earth, the Earth's first ultra-social species. And that species is not the social insects, it's Homo sapiens. What we can do has never been done before. And I hope that we can get beyond this idea that the only thing that people can do is disturb the balance of nature, a very obsolete concept. We need to think about our cultures of nature and how we are become entangled with the rest of life on Earth and how we can shape the future of nature better. And of course, there's no better time to think about this than right now during the pandemic, when it's more obvious than ever just how connected we are with the rest of the biological world. And I actually have been using this slide since before the pandemic even was imagined, in talking about the human microbiome. And if we were giving a talk normally, I'd be right there in the room with you and I'd be saying, we're all connected through microbes. We're only about 90% human as individuals. The other 10% is other species that live within us and connect us with all the rest of the biological world. We can't just use science to solve the future. The future really is about what people want to do together socially. And so ultimately, I'm just going to finish with that message that humans have become a force of nature, but our superpower is a social superpower. What can we do with that social superpower? All right, with that, I'll end, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Erle. There's a great deal to think with there. I will turn things over though to Kushank, who's gonna, and Naveen, who will manage questions, or I'll do that too, but we'll start with two student questions, if those have showed up yet. Let me just switch over my view.
Earl, could you stop sharing your screen?
Oh, should I stop?
Would you like
Yeah,
to
that'd
stop
be great,
sharing your
because then we
screen?
can see the whole gallery of people and watch
Yeah.
hands with questions.
Okay. I'm looking for hands here. I'll let you guys.
I don't see any hands yet.
Okay.
There's always a bit of a pause. It's a Zoom thing.
Yes, I know.
All right, Nigel.
I can kick us off. Thank you for that really, really interesting talk. A couple of us are in this class right now on social ecological systems, so this is just so relevant and interesting, and it's brought up a bunch of the stuff that's come up in the class so far this year. One thing I want to know about is, after talking about the megafauna extinctions a little while ago and getting into when did human impact on the planet really start, I came across this, it seems like an active debate in the literature still, between a blitzkrieg hypothesis and a stitzkrieg hypothesis of were humans solely or primarily responsible for wiping out these megafauna, or was it more of a climate event that humans were just sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, or this final little piece that caused stress to these large species of mammals, because it was so closely related to when we arrived on these different continents, but hard to come up with a reason why we would have overhunted our food source and things like that. So yeah, just wondering if you could start us off with what type of impact did we have on those early populations?
Well, the truth is that pretty much all the evidence, besides some theoretical models, is what you'd call just correlations, right? People show up. There's been a lot of arguments that there haven't been the kind of bone piles and mass kills, evidence from those that some people would want to see in order to fully attribute or majorly attribute human societies for driving the Pleistocene megafauna extinctions. And I also think it's a good idea to be skeptical of any unicausal model. When someone says it's just climate, as recently some people just published a paper like that just said it was just climate. And of course, people come back and say, no, it's not just climate. It's never as simple as one cause, I would say. How did humans contribute? And the reality is that it depends on which species you're talking about. When you talk about the megafauna species in different continents, there's some cases where the case is pretty much closed. Some of the Australian megafauna, there's almost no doubt, and they do have some mass kills to show that people did wipe out some of these species. Some of them are very hard to live with, by the way. They're not all these species that are just food. But it's mostly through very effective hunting pressures that could reduce population sizes. Some of these megafauna don't ever have very big populations, so they're always pretty vulnerable. And they've lived through many glacial intervals as extreme or more extreme than the lower Dryas, or the late ones that were occurring around the end of the Pleistocene. But I don't think there's a firm 100% consensus. I can tell you there's a lot of arguments going on among different people in that community. And we should also not neglect to talk about the island extinctions. That's another set of extinctions that people started causing more than 10,000 years ago. You don't have to be agricultural or industrial to drive an extinction.
Thank you.
I think we have Juan next.
Hi, Erle. Thanks for the amazing talk. You touched on so many things, so I'll try to nail down my question, which touches upon several of the things you mentioned. So you mentioned that ultra-sociality is like one of our superpowers as humans, and that through that we can kind of shape our future. But I also see like our highly developed and large social systems as a barrier to take action. And so I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on like how do we move forward when so many of us have to agree on large scale problems. But then you also mentioned like the local action, and some of the decision just tends to happen locally, and it's shaping global patterns. So how to move around that? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, you're raising fundamental questions that have been with human societies forever, I would say, and kind of one of the sides of the whole. There's a lot of research on collapse, And the most interesting research is through archaeologists, really, who study that, the social scientists who study those collapses directly. And for the most part, the concept of a collapsing society is somewhat of a fiction. This society could have already collapsed. You could see evidence of it in the archaeological record of the future, and see certain things being eliminated, people dispersing and not staying concentrated and things like that. But yet somehow the language, the currencies, a lot of things would continue anyway. But the bottom line is effective societies that can navigate through environmental challenges, they generally tend to be different than the ones that don't. And that is usually how you could effectively describe a collapse. And societies that can't build infrastructure, societies that can't essentially create more buy-in at the bottom level of society. In other words, if there's no real reason to remain a worker in this society because the benefits for you are just not there, they're all going to the top. Those kind of massive inequalities are tied into societies that do collapse. And Tainter's book on collapse really talks a lot about that other element that you brought up. Larger scale societies can develop such complex decision-making processes. The whole Byzantine process is something that also can explain dysfunction in societies. So it's true, there's societies that navigate successfully through these environmental challenges, and there's some that don't. And whether or not we are in one category or another is a little bit like knowing in advance when a tipping point is going to happen. It's almost impossible to know. With hindsight, it's really easy to see. But while you're in it, there's things that are working for and things that are working against effective societal adaptations and changes. And so I can't say for sure where we are at all. I would not pretend that just because we have the potential to do something that we actually will. But I would argue that we actually do have the potential to do things very differently. And I do see that some of that is also happening. So that's good news. But that could just be a selective reading. We might actually be, you could look at also the bad news things, and you can make a list of reasons why things will just get worse. I don't think that would be a very effective way to navigate toward the future, though. I think taking stock of what works and trying to work harder on those things is a more effective strategy.
All right, I think Terry, you are next, but I'm going to skip over you and take another student if you don't mind. Erica.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. And it's also really timely for another class that we're taking right now, which is conservation science with Claire. And we actually had a discussion yesterday, the day before yesterday, on working lands. And I led the discussion, and I looked more into this Mesoamerican biological corridor in Central America. And one thing that I was thinking about, and that I've been thinking about lately, is how this Mesoamerican biological corridor has been there for a while now. It's been almost 30 years. And after 30 years, maybe they've accomplished like biodiversity conservation, but for the people, I think it's still not working because the people there are still struggling, and still, we've heard about these migrant caravans coming from Central America to the US. And I guess my question is, if we, because I agree, science cannot do it alone. And sometimes no matter how much new data or tools we can come up to, it is community involvement and political will that can have a true impact. But should we expect communities that are already disadvantaged and struggling, that are facing other tangible, more immediate problems like violence, hunger, to act while they're just trying to survive?
Yeah, that is the question of how you can successfully navigate through these challenges, is how can these kinds of practices be incentivized? Because in the long term, if the practices of conservation, for example, do not provide enough benefits to local people, they won't succeed. I mean, nothing will succeed. You could argue that the biological corridor is a success, but I would bet it's not nearly the kind of success it could be if, for example, it behaved more like Northern Rangelands Trust in Kenya, where the way that you start doing conservation is you say, what is it that would advance your local system? What would advance your local communities? And you start with, for example, we're going to build a school, or we're going to improve the drinking water, whatever the community wants. That's how you start. You don't start with a corridor. You start with, they have some corridor projects too. You start with, how can we make sure that the community is getting something out of this, that we're addressing that. And once it's clear to the community that that's what this process is going to be about, it's going to be about a fair exchange and a development opportunity, or an opportunity to solve some local problems. Then they start getting interested and get creative. They come up with their own ideas. They may know much better about where the elephants are than the conservation people do. For example, they might know much more about the conflicts. They know much more about who's poaching than anybody outside the community does. And so when they have buy-in, they themselves become the process that motivates more and more conservation. They're like, hey, can we do some more conservation, get another school? Or can we send some kids to college outside and they can come back and open a hotel here or whatever? And so from my point of view, that's the future of conservation, is making it as effective at supporting what people want as it is for conserving nature. It's not always easy to do, but it's the basis for success and sustainability.
Okay, Terry?
Thanks, Erle. This is such a big picture conversation. There are many places to enter, but I'm just thinking about the long-term trend. So no argument that less land per person equals more transformation, but there's also so much variation in these niches globally. Is there anything you can say from looking at that long-term trend over time that suggests preconditions that make that speed or scale of transformation lesser? I mean, coastal communities have lots of abundance, and so you get less transformation of land or other things. But in general, what does variation of those niches tell us about that overall trend? And is there something to be learned there?
Well, I think you pointed it out pretty directly, is that, and this is a fact of the human sociocultural niche, is that it's not more homogeneous than it was. There's more and more ways of being human over time. And a lot of the old ways are just as good as they ever were. They work just as well when they're in the context that they have been in, and are highly adaptive and have continued, whereas others have not. And there are plenty of examples of kind of failed sociocultural systems out there. And ours may appear that way in the future. The fossil fuel society is definitely, you have to look at in the big picture. It's got to be a very short-term strategy, because there's only so much fossil fuel. Even if you do want to burn it all up and change the climate, it's just not a long-term practice that you can do. But I think diversity is strength, just like it's something that we try to manage for in conservation. It's something that should be managed for in society. If everyone is doing exactly the same thing, you have a much less stable and effective society at navigating challenges of all different kinds, and a society in which there's lots of ways to engage in society, lots of niches is a good thing. So I think diversity is one of those basic principles of doing these things. Everyone shouldn't be doing the same thing.
Thanks. I could go on there, but I'll let somebody else ask a question. No argument on diversity.
Claire?
Thanks, Erle, for a great talk. And also, I want to thank you for your optimistic can-do perspective. I think it's really great to hear perspectives like this in these times. My question is about, you mentioned how cities are really, require the most intensive agriculture nearby to provide that food. Or I guess you didn't say nearby, but just that intensive agriculture. And my question was whether we could dig in a little bit to who feeds the cities, just because I know there's been a lot of questions about, how much do small smallholder farmers contribute to our overall food supply? That's one question. Another question is, to what extent do large industrial scale farmers produce a lot of grains that are mostly feeding livestock and so not so much feeding people? So there's sort of two opposite narratives there. And I imagine there's also a great deal of variation among cities as to the extent to which, depending on where they are, they might be fed primarily by these more industrial stream food sources or more smallholder food sources. And there's even urban agriculture, which some people claim is very important for adding to the food supply. So I just wondered if you could build out a little bit or flesh out, nuance that that's the statement you made about who feeds the cities.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot there, and good to see you, Claire. I'm glad you were able to be here. I was hoping to see you. Well, the truth is so there's a bunch of different questions there. But as far as who feeds the cities, you know, the interesting thing about that narrative of the larger scale producers, those who produce a lot of surplus, producing for the cities, because that's where people, you know, are mostly engaging in the marketplace for food. That's an old narrative. You know, it's prehistoric almost. It's not just modern societies or contemporary societies that are doing that. And with urban agriculture, I mean, there's no doubt that urban agriculture can serve some parts of urban societies that are underserved or not served at all by, you know, the supermarket. So there's some value there for sure. But in terms of the total amount of food that is feeding, you know, calories and this sort of thing, I think it's pretty clear that the larger scale globalized food chain is feeding most people in the urban areas of the world today. There probably are exceptions because, as I said, diversity is kind of a rule. There's got to be some cities that are kind of different, and maybe those cities could become more common, and maybe that would be a good thing. I don't have a particular agenda on that, but I think that the idea that, you know, you're going to feed billions of people with a surplus production of farmers, for a lot of people, I don't know, it's very hard to even bother to produce a large surplus of food unless there's some really urgent economic need. And that's, you know, people, the farmers that are only responding to the economy, just, you know, market demand, they're the ones that are producing this vast amount of calories and protein that are feeding billions of people. But it's not to say that the other forms of agriculture aren't essential also. I just wonder whether they can provide that massive amount of food. Like, I'll give you a simple example. The food that's produced in cities is not, you know, wheat. If you were producing wheat in the city, that's just not going to work. Now, wheat is actually, strangely enough, not produced that intensively compared to corn, for example, or maize, which is much more intensive than wheat generally. But this is actually a good question for Naveen too. Probably the next global analysis, you know. I know that you just had a paper out that was pretty cool talking about how productive small scale farmers are. But if you're a Bosrupian, right, the reason is pretty simple. They have no other choice. They're producing as much as they possibly can because if they don't, they're really in, you know, it's hardship for them. It's not necessarily that they're responding to the demands of the city. They're responding to their own demands. Well, some people claim also hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah, some people claim that they're really extremely important in the, you know, in producing surplus food. And you could also wonder, since often the infrastructure isn't there to get their products to market, that, you know, that's a major constraint. So possibly they could be contributing more.
No, absolutely. And there's parts of the world, you know, China was a place that, you know, for a long time, that was government policy, was that, right, they had the state farms, but they didn't scale them up beyond their areas, right? Most farmers in China were always household responsibility farmers. And under that condition, you know, that they were feeding the city through government programs, and they built infrastructure to support that. And, you know, it did function for some time, but the reason it changed was really that the incentive of small scale farmers to produce more on a very small amount of land was very low, because the maximum amount of income you can generate from a very small amount of land doesn't allow you to go to the middle class of a society. It doesn't enable you to develop. It's just barely enough to get by. And it's just a scale issue. You just can't produce that much in a small area. And when you have your next generation, it's an even smaller area. So it's a real challenge, I think, to feed the world with small farms.
Terry, did you have a follow-up? Terry, did you have a follow-up question?
Sorry, I was not unmuted. No, I'm good, Naveen, though I'm interested in this question in the chat about smaller farms.
Yeah, I just posted a response back. I mean, I think we estimated that there's a whole continuum. So the small doesn't start at 2 hectares, right? So globally, people use 2 hectares. In our paper, we estimated the amount of food produced, we differentiated between food, feed, and other uses of crop products. We estimated that about a third of the world's food is produced by farms less than 2 hectares. But then if you look at farms less than 50 hectares, I think it was closer to 50% or larger. So anyway, there's a whole continuum, but I think beyond size, we also need to be thinking about what other benefits that smallholders provide. And I think that our most recent paper showed that smallholders are also, smaller farms also harbor greater biodiversity. And the other more important thing is 80% of the world's farmers are smallholders. So from a humanitarian perspective, we need to be thinking about supporting them as well. There seems to be one more question.
That's true everywhere because of the distribution of farm size. And you know, the US, right. It's 85% of the farmers are small farmers.
Yeah.
And they produce 15% of the food. That was an estimate from a number of years ago, but it used to be true at least.
There seem to be 2 more questions at the last minute. So I'll take Joshua and hopefully we have time for Annie as well.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask, do you sort of perceive that like the human modification of the planet is sort of an inevitable thing? Because you sort of mentioned at the start that like, you know, the lighting up of the world is just a sort of emergent thing, which has like happened, and it's not like one person that actually did that, right? And does that sense of kind of inevitability like change your sort of moral viewpoint on like nature conservation and stuff, and like whether we should try and conserve the planet? And then also a second thing I just wanted to ask is that you said that with having sort of large scale agriculture, then you're only using the best quality land. But do you think there's a potential problem there where the sort of best quality land is the bits that might have been the best for nature anyway, whereas all the bits that are kind of left over and not farms are potentially just like deserts and mountains and stuff that aren't actually that great for nature?
Yeah, two big questions. All right, the first one about this idea that, well, people are going to shape nature no matter what. And I think, you know, from my point of view, it's one of those things that if you want to imagine another way of existing on Earth, that's very nice. But, you know, 8 billion people living anywhere near the way that we do now. And it would be worse, of course, if 8 billion hunter-gatherers were living on the planet, because first of all, it's not possible. But the amount of transformation that humans are going to have on this planet is going to be huge no matter what. I really do think there's, like, anyone who thinks that there's going to be like humans don't make a big difference on the planet at this point is not a reasonable strategy. So it's more a question of how you guide the human interaction toward better outcomes, both for people, and people won't do stuff that doesn't produce better outcomes for people. You know, even if that just means changing your values and saying, well, it's good for me to lose the land because now I have my fellow wildlife species. But there's got to be a motivation, I think, for people to really act on anything. But I think there is the real possibility of, and real genuine possibility that the future could look much better in terms of conservation than today, for a number of reasons, cultural, and the fact that we do have the ability to do it. The scaling possibilities are real. All right, then the other question about, you know, people coveting the best land for themselves, especially, you know, the more powerful members of a society, right? The ones who have the big money in agriculture take up all the land from everyone else and farm it intensively and produce, you know, the biggest money and all that. And what does that do to the planet? Well, unfortunately, it is kind of like you look at the planet the way it is, and it's one of those forces that has shaped the planet the way it is. And you go to the grasslands and, the grasslands are great for agriculture and there's not a whole lot left anywhere for other species. That doesn't mean it has to be completely that way, but it is a fact on the ground. And so if you want to do more conservation of grassland species, and there are some very interesting projects coming into play now, like bringing back the American bison in large herds, like that sort of strategy is more and more possible, even with larger scale agriculture, through creative partnerships. And I didn't talk about that in my talk, but it's something I often do talk about. For example, well, I don't want to use up all the time on it, but there's a lot of strategies that enable large scale operations to actually work with wildlife effectively too. They just have to be incentivized and have to have the techniques to do it. But it's inevitable there's going to be some conflict here. This is a challenge. I mean, this is the negotiation of the Anthropocene that is what determines a better future or not. Can we negotiate toward the better future? And it's going to be, there's going to be, players in the game who have different points of view. Anyone who thinks that's not going to be part of the game is just not being realistic.
Well, we are past our usual time, but if you're willing to stay, there may be more questions. And so people, you're welcome to stay on, but or also feel free to leave. Do you have more time?
I have more time, no problem.
All right, so let's go to Annie.
Well, my question is actually very much in line with Sim's question. I wanted to bring us back a little bit to the agriculture part, and I was wondering how, perhaps a global change to more, what has been deemed a more sustainable diet, so things that would include less meat and perhaps less processed food would maybe take away that pressure to produce as much grain, as much crops that are needed in large scales and are needed outside of cities. And would such a transformation to more plant-based options favor smaller scale farmers to take up a larger part of the market?
Those are, so I don't, there's maybe 3 different parts of that I'm getting. The kind of eating a healthier diet. I mean, the diets of a lot of developing country people are so unhealthy as to, send you to the emergency room. And so, that's an incentive to change that right there. One of the more interesting, and there's the kind of dramatic, like everyone goes vegan. You see that, it's like Beck's, the, bioenergy with carbon sequestration and storage, like these kind of really dramatic knobs you can turn on a global thinking model that aren't really realistic at all. Okay, everyone's not going to become a vegan. That's just not going to happen. But there's an amazing number of little knobs out there that are also functioning. Like the biggest effect on diet in the US with meat eating is just the shift from beef to chicken. Incredible, huge effects on the American diet, on American demand for different crops and all that kind of stuff, and demand for land. And nobody tried to do that one either. There wasn't like this. I mean, there's a couple companies that are really happy that you're eating more chicken, but it's not it was not a program to do it. It was merely like a kind of like people got information from the medical people that said, you better eat a healthier diet. And what did they choose? They chose to eat chicken. So there's a lot of that going on. Eating more fish. There's a lot of incremental differences. And I think those are already happening in the developed world. There tends to be, and there's actually a good paper by Eric Sanderson, if you haven't seen it, in Bioscience called The Bottleneck and the Breakthrough, that talks about kind of the dynamics of the society. It's just like the demographic transition. And the demographic transition, the transitional phase between becoming from an agricultural society to an industrial society, in the middle you get this dramatic peak of population growth, but then it levels off. People learn how to be industrial and they do it differently than they do it at the beginning. And the same is true of diets. It's no longer cool to eat so much meat, and be incredibly overweight because of it and this sort of thing, or get heart disease. And so people are adapting to these new things. As for unprocessed food, that I think is an interesting question mark. It's popular to talk about, and it's true that it's generally healthier, but it's not always healthier. And I'll give you a simple example is the Impossible Burger, which is taking off. Now it's still a blip. It's still not changing everything, but it is the kind of thing that can. Things like that get popular enough. It's just as good to eat more cool to eat an Impossible Burger than a regular hamburger. That's a highly processed food if you've ever seen it. It's a high-tech food. And it's not bad. tastes pretty good. It's better for your health than the alternative. And so there's a lot of that, I think. It's not all going to be the dramatic choices or like turning the knob all the way to 11 on the, everyone stops eating meat, but more all the different ways that people navigate toward, better strategies for themselves, better strategies for society, better strategies for the environment. How much of that is driven by environmental consciousness is always a big question mark. I mean, the main thing that's driven population growth to decline is not the environment, and never has been and never will be. And whenever it comes up as the reason to have no children, it creates problems. The main reason to have family planning is because it's good for you. It's good for women. It's good for society. It's good for people. People like having planned families. It's a good thing. Not everybody, but it's popular.
So on that note, I want to ask you a question. You at some point showed, declining population growth rates, but when you were talking earlier about socio-cultural niche construction, you said, looking far into the future, you said something about where are we going to end up with trillions, and that kind of caught my attention. So
okay, yeah, I'm sorry about that. That was kind of like just spitball in there. I would say it's theoretically possible. Actually, you know what? So maybe you do or don't know this, but I wrote an op-ed about human carrying capacity for the New York Times in 2013. And the editor insisted on calling it was called There's No Human Carrying Capacity. And it's basically a similar thing that I said today, right? There's different carrying capacities depending on what kind of culture you're in and what you're doing with the environment for the amount of land you need, right? But they wanted to title it Overpopulation is Not the Problem. And I got slammed, as you can imagine. I mean, the hate mail was just unbelievable. I'd never experienced anything like that in my life. But one person sent a very nice note, and that person was Cesar Marchetti. Have you ever heard of him? If you haven't, he's a really interesting character. He's an engineer, Italian engineer from, he was a contemporary of Ehrlich's. He wrote a paper, and he sent it to me, called 10 to the 12th. That's all the paper is called. It's literally the title. It's 10 to the 12th. Like with a power sign, and it's you can guess what it's about. It's about how you would have 1 trillion people live on Earth. And he says that's completely plausible. And you read it and it's like, yeah, it's theoretically possible. Now, the big question is not whether it's possible, but whether it's a good idea. Is it better? Do you want to live like a chicken in a cage? Or do you want to live in another kind of world? And I think most people thinking about it don't want to live like a chicken in a cage. It's just not an appealing option. And that's really what this is about. It's not all these hard limit discussions. It's really about how do people want to live? And as we know, right, there's not one way. There's never going to be one way. People are going to want to live in different ways. In one society, you're never all going to be thinking the same thing. And certainly among societies, it's not going to be the same thing. So how you negotiate together toward the better future together, that's the real challenge. And it's not a small challenge. I'm not trying to diminish it by saying, oh yeah, no problem, we just do what we want to do. That actually is hard, very, very hard. But I think it is the focus for me. That I think about how do you incentivize people in general to negotiate with each other toward better futures.
Any last questions?
Just on that last comment, if diversity is hugely important, then why is conversation so essential?
Because coexistence is not something that occurs automatically. And I think there's never been a time when that's been more obvious. I think there's been a lot, I mean, especially as an American, it's just been so incredible, the conflict and in this country. And it created a form of paralysis that it seems like we're seeing a little lifting of that, but I don't know. We'll see. We have to wait a little bit to see how it's really going to play out.
See.
But it's no easy matter.
Guinea. Looks like Guinea has a question.
A very quick question regarding diversity. I'd like to know your thoughts, Erle, on kind of dietary homogenization and also the risks of cultural homogenization as we get more global and get to these trillions of people.
Well, I mean, clearly you have some things that have spread across the world, that like everybody's wearing Nike shoes and stuff like that, right? There's no question that globalization, the fact that we're in real-time communication globally now, which is really you just have to think about how amazing that is, that it's even possible. Yeah, you're seeing like everyone's playing the same online games, or not everyone, a lot of people are. But, you know, let's face it, the other thing that's come along with this is that, you know, when you go out in Vancouver, can you have every kind of food in the world if you want? That wasn't true before. That is part of globalization too, is a diversifying effect. So you get both. You get some things that go really mainstream and boring, you could say. And then you get some things that get much more interesting and diverse. So it's a little bit of both. I don't think it's an all or nothing pattern. It's kind of a little bit of both. Some homogenization, some diversification occurs at the same time. And I don't think either of them can be stopped. I think they both are kind of inevitable. You will have some homogenization. You will have some diversification. That's what happens when you get all these people together from different cultures.
All right. So maybe it's a good time to close our seminar. I think the headline message that we'll take away is the world at 1 trillion. Erle Ellis says
no,
the
let's
world
not
will
go with
hit
that one. Let's pick another one.
The press release. Thank you so much, Erle, for joining us. Ever since I moved to UBC 6 years ago, we've been talking about having Erle come visit, and ironically, we made it happen during the pandemic virtually. One day,
you can invite me again.
Person.
I'll come. I love
yeah,
Vancouver.
Exactly.
Look forward to
so
that.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah. All right, my pleasure. Much. Yeah, thanks for listening.
Great
and asking such great questions.
Take care, everyone. Enjoy the weather.